The echo of ashes. The fire didn't begin with flames. It began with silence. A strange, uncomfortable silence that settled over the streets of Sparta like an invisible fog. There were no screams, only the dry sound of sandals on cobblestones and the restless rustling of the ephors' robes. A city that once roared with the fury of its warriors now whispered, as if speaking to the gods or to the dead. The Peloponnesian War was officially a conflict between Sparta and Athens. But that was just the surface. Beneath the layers of history, another truth seeped, a war of ideas, of paranoia, of pride in slow combustion. And at its center, Sparta, this war machine made of flesh, iron, and absolute obedience. At the dawn of war, Spartans still walked tall, with round shields, sharpened spears, and fearless eyes. The entire society was a gear built to kill and die. Every boy torn from his mother for brutal training in the agoge, every unshed tear, was a silent offering to the god of war, and that god always seemed hungry. But something changed, and that something started from within. Veteran generals began whispering about the visions of their warriors, recurring dreams, dogs with human eyes, battlefields where blood flowed upward as if the gods rejected it. Then came the plague in Athens, a sickness that killed thousands. Sparta celebrated, but they didn't realize the dead were coming for them too, with slow, deliberate steps. To the north, Sparta's allies began to hesitate. The war, which was supposed to be a glorious and swift campaign, turned into a swamp of uncertainty, betrayal, and deserters. And then came the rumor that Athens was no longer fighting alone, but with the help of something Sparta couldn't understand. Philosophy, art, questioning. It was like an invisible disease. To think. The ephors called secret meetings. The oracles were consulted. What was seen in the entrails of the sacrificed animals was kept hidden, but the priests' faces were pale. Somewhere, in the heart of the city, a fire was lit, not to warm, but to purify. And so began slowly the burning, not of buildings, but of convictions. Sparta did not fall to enemy spears. It began to crumble in the empty gaze of its own heroes, and it all began with Lysander. Lysander was the symbol of Spartan strength, a revered commander, a ruthless strategist. He did not fear blood nor the gods, but he feared time. Not the time of days and nights, but the time that turns glory into dust. The final victory over Athens, it was the emptiness of peace. While the armies still marched, a new war was growing in the city's shadows. The war of doubt. The young men who had returned from the front no longer spoke the same. Some questioned. Others dreamed of democracies, of art, of freedom, ideas that to Sparta were poison. The agoge, once brutal and infallible, no longer forged warriors as it once had. Boys cried at night, and the trainers pretended not to hear. One of them disappeared. They said he had fled to Athens, or that he had been taken by something that lived in the forests near the Eurotas, where old gods still whispered in the leaves. The ephors intensified the rituals, more sacrifices, more blood on the altars. But the gods remained silent. Lysander, haunted by nightly visions, began to write. Texts, thoughts, questions. He kept everything in scrolls locked away under heavy guard. His eyes had changed. They no longer searched for the enemy outside, but for the collapse within the Spartan soul. And he knew no one there was ready for it. In the streets, the elders whispered of a fever without a body that gripped the youth. It wasn't illness. It was a restlessness that corroded like rust. It was the weight of a city that had forgotten how to live. It only knew how to kill. And then, in the 6th month of the siege of Athens, Sparta began to lose without battles. Its decisions became erratic. Its victories, hollow. There was an invisible crack running through the city walls, and no one dared to face it. On a moonless night, Lysander climbed the Spartan Acropolis alone. He gazed upon the sleeping city, cloaked in shadows, and he wrote one final line in his scroll. Perhaps our greatest weakness was believing we were made of stone, but even stone under pressure turns to dust. The whispers of iron. The silence that once cloaked the city now became a muffled scream. It echoed in the forgotten spears, the cracked shields, in the walls that still bore past glories like scars carved in stone. Something was rotting from within, and it smelled of rusted iron and betrayed promises. Death was no longer a noble offering, but a reminder of the fragility hidden beneath the armor. Warriors returned from the battlefields not with honor, but with hollow stares, as if parts of their souls had been left buried in the mud of Boeotia or the ruins of Delos. They spoke little. When they did, it was in fragments, about shadows in the valleys, hissing voices around the campfires, and worse, memories of battles that had never occurred, as if they had fought something that wasn't human. It was in this atmosphere that a group of young men disappeared, not in combat. They vanished within the city itself. Some said they had fled, others that they had been taken. An old wall guard swore he had seen hooded figures in the shadows, walking silently in single file toward the ruins of the temple of Artemis Orthia, where Spartans had long since stopped praying. When they searched, all they found were marks on the ground, as if someone had been dragged, and symbols etched into the stones in blood. Sparta was becoming a living ruin, not from destruction, but from implosion. The council began to fracture. Some ephors began to disappear as well, and rumors spoke of staged suicides, of bodies found with their eyes removed, as if they could no longer bear what they had seen. Others said it was divine punishment. But there was a more terrifying theory that Sparta had touched something, an ancient forbidden truth buried beneath its own myths, and now that something was waking. Lysander no longer appeared in public. His scrolls were found by a servant scattered across the floor of his home like dead leaves. In them he wrote of a hallway of mirrors beneath the earth, where ancient warriors screamed eternally, without mouths. He wrote of an echo that wounds, a sound that spread among the soldiers like a fever, and of one word that returned again and again like a poisoned refrain, anamnesis, the remembrance of what should remain forgotten. Meanwhile, in Athens, the spirit of the city seemed to strengthen despite the war, not through weapons, but through ideas. Poets wrote of the fall of reason. Philosophers spoke of Sparta's death even before its defeat. One of them, a disciple of Socrates, publicly proclaimed, "They still march, but into the abyss." The Athenians laughed. But there was something true in that mockery. In Sparta, the temples began to be sealed, as if the people themselves feared the gods they once worshipped. And in their place, small circles began to form, night meetings, people with wide eyes speaking in forgotten tongues. The guards did not interfere. They listened and left without a word. In the central forge, where once iron was struck to the rhythm of war drums, only laments could now be heard. A blacksmith who had worked for 40 years simply laid his hammer on the ground and never spoke again. They say he saw something in the metal, something that reflected back, but was not his own face. Sparta was burning, not in flames, but in delirium. And at the center of that delirium, Lysander was writing his final confession, a warning or a curse. But it had not yet been read. Lysander's scroll. Lysander's scroll was found 3 days after his death. It was carefully rolled, sealed with black wax, marked by a symbol no one recognized, a circle intersected by a wavering line, like a sleeping serpent. Those who read it were never the same. The first sentence echoed like a verdict. We are not warriors. We are prisoners of a forgotten pact, sealed in the name of gods who are either long gone or who never existed. The words that followed were not accounts of battles or military strategies. They were lucid delusions, confessions of a man who had crossed the veils of reality. He spoke of a recurring dream in which he wandered through a distorted Sparta where statues wept blood and children were born without eyes. In this nightmare city, gods walked among men, but demanded absolute silence. Any sound was punished with madness. He also spoke of an underground chamber hidden beneath the very Acropolis, accessible only on moonless nights. In it, a stone throne, empty, but bearing traces of flesh. He wrote that when he sat on it, he heard a voice in his mind, a familiar voice, the voice of Sparta. You belong to us. You owe us every broken bone, every repressed tear. You are the altar, and also the sacrifice. The ephors tried to contain the content of the confession, but it was too late. Copies began to circulate. Military leaders, elders, and young initiates all began to have identical nightmares. Some mutilated themselves, others vanished into the forests. A group of terrified soldiers refused to fight. They were executed publicly, but no one applauded. The city had become a fevered body. The winds carried the smell of burning flesh, though there were no fires. The stones felt warm to the touch, even at night. And the crows, once mere omens, now circled the temples like sentinels of something lurking nearby. A boy from the Agoge was found dead. Carved into his chest with a knife was one of Lysander's phrases. They live through us, and we die, so they may continue to exist. The council was divided. Half wanted to destroy all the scrolls. The other half, silently, began to worship their content. The city was cracked like a mirror on the verge of shattering. It was then that a delegation from Athens arrived. Diplomats, spies, no one knew for sure, but they brought something with them. A gift, an artifact, circular in shape, wrapped in red velvet, which they called mnemosine. A metallic sculpture, black as obsidian, inscribed with symbols that pulsed under the sunlight. They claimed it was an offering of peace, but it was more than that. That night, after receiving the artifact, one of the eldest ephors was found dead. Next to him, drawn in blood on the ground, was the same symbol from Lysander's scroll. Before dying, he had whispered, "They are reminding us." Mnemosine, the name of the goddess of memory, or of something that feeds on it. In the days that followed, people began to remember things they had never lived. Wars never fought, parallel lives, deaths in spirals. It was as if Sparta were being invaded, not by armies, but by memories that belonged to no one. A psychic invasion. The warriors slept with their eyes open. The oracles, once mute, now screamed incoherent phrases, many in extinct tongues. One of them repeated the same thing over and over. She returns, she returns, she returns. And as the city sank into a collective trance, a hooded figure was seen walking the streets, always at night, always in silence. Where it passed, the torches extinguished themselves. They said it was Lysander, or something using his form. Sparta was no longer a place. It was a state of mind, and the mind was breaking. The city that whispers Sparta no longer behaved like a city. Its walls, once rigid, seemed to bend at impossible angles, as if even geometry had surrendered. Time no longer obeyed either. Days dragged on like centuries. Nights lasted only minutes. There were reports of men who had gone out to fetch water and returned with white hair, children who spoke like elders, and shadows that moved even under the full light of day. The guards no longer stood watch. They remained frozen, staring into the void. They claimed to hear voices coming from the stones, whispers calling them by their childhood names, as if the city itself were trying to seduce them with memories. And it worked. One by one, they abandoned their posts, walking away until they vanished into the hills, where the old temple of Cronus, the devourer of children, had been sealed for generations. The Mnemosyne had been placed at the center of the agora as a symbol of peace. But something was growing around it, not a plant nor a sculpture. It was like vegetation made of bones and shadows, faintly pulsing. Some claimed they could hear a heartbeat coming from it. Others swore that if they stared long enough, they would see their own distorted faces reflected on that black surface, as if the object was absorbing the identity of whoever gazed upon it. More deaths followed, but not at the hands of enemies. In fact, Athens was no longer a threat. Sparta had won the external war, but what remained was far worse. The war against itself. Leaders hanged themselves in silence, children vanished into the night, and the mothers, some awoke to find their arms covered in blood, with no memory of how. At the Agoge, instructors began killing their own trainees. They said the boys were possessed, that they spoke impossible languages in their sleep, that they drew maps in charcoal, maps of non-existent places, cities beneath the sea, fortresses among the stars, labyrinths within the human body itself. One boy was found with his chest opened, his heart removed with surgical precision. On the wall, written in blood, was a single word: anamnesis. The remaining ephors fell into desperation. They ordered the destruction of the Mnemosyne. But when the soldiers tried, their spears simply shattered in the air. An invisible force repelled them, or worse, attracted them. One soldier touched the object and stood motionless for hours. When he finally moved, he whispered, "She is watching us. She never left." And then he tore out his own eyes. Talk began of a return, not of Lysander, but of something older, something that had been imprisoned in ancient times, when Sparta sealed its iron pact with war, something that demanded absolute obedience. And now, freed by doubt, it was coming back to claim its price. People began drawing circles on their houses. Small stone totems were erected in silence, each with 7 carvings. Someone remembered that Lysander had repeatedly mentioned the number 7 in his writings. 7 stages, 7 names, 7 steps into the void. The borders of the city began to blur. Literally. There was mist on the roads, even at midday. Travelers could no longer enter or leave. Some vanished. Others returned, but different. Their voices altered, their eyes completely black. One of them, when interrogated, simply answered, "Sparta no longer exists. Now it remembers." On moonless nights, something walked among the houses, bare feet, heavy breathing, a presence that did not hide. On the contrary, it wanted to be felt. One general in delirium claimed to have seen the city itself take human form, a woman cloaked in veils of iron and flesh, bearing the face of every mother who had lost a son to war. And amid this chaos, this involuntary cult of forgetting and remembering, a new name began to rise among the whispers: Aletheia, the truth that awakens, the truth that hurts. Sparta had forgotten something essential. Now it was being forced to remember, and each memory demanded a price. When the stones weep, they say that in the end there was no explosion, no screams, not even blood. Sparta disappeared in silence, like a candle snuffed out by a breeze that should not have existed. No ruins remained, only the memory of a place that dared to forget what it truly was. The chronicles ceased, no letters were sent, no emissaries returned. The city, once feared for its steel, became an absence on the map. Some travelers claimed to see from a distance towers shimmering at sunset, like mirages made of unresolved pain. But when they approached, all they found was a field where not even the birds sang. The final trace was a fragment of parchment found among the roots of a dead tree on the banks of the Eurotas River. Written in trembling strokes, it read, "We forged our children into blades and forgot that every blade needs a hand and a heart." And that was the epitaph of a civilization built upon denial. Denial of affection, of doubt, of art, of free memory. Sparta taught the world how to wage war, but forgot to teach itself how to live after the war. And what of those who survived? Some wandered into other cities, carrying in their eyes an abyss no philosopher could understand. They refused to speak of Sparta, as if uttering the name would summon something. Others went mad. They drew labyrinths on walls, chanted senseless hymns. One of them, near Delphi, was seen building a miniature city out of animal bones. Always 7 houses, always a central circle with an empty throne. What remained in the end was neither a military lesson nor a political warning. It was a mirror. Sparta was the distorted reflection of humanity's desire for absolute control, for identity without questioning, for silence where there should have been music, for iron where there should have been flesh. And that reflection still lives, in regimes that impose fear as virtue, in families that suffocate feelings in the name of honor, in the inner voices that command us to silence our pain and move forward without ever looking back. But the truth is simple, cruel and inevitable. Everything that is buried returns. And when it returns, it does not come back as a memory. It comes as a haunting. Today, when we hear about Sparta, we think of strength, discipline, military glory. But there is something we forget. Every wall, no matter how high, is only invincible until someone dares to look at what it is hiding within. Sparta burned, but the fire came from within, fueled by years of silence, obedience, and fear disguised as courage. And when it finally remembered, when the city looked at itself in the mirror, it was already too late. But perhaps that was its greatest offering to the world, an uncomfortable memory, a voiceless warning. And a question that still smolders like embers. What if what we fear most is not the enemy outside, but what we find when we finally remove the helmet?
Thank you for watching this video. We ask you to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Also, activate the notification bell to be informed about our new posts. See you in the next video.